The story of the American Revolution begins long before the first musket was fired, in the quiet lives of the 13 colonies scattered along the eastern seaboard. Life in these settlements was a delicate balance of survival, aspiration, and community. Farmers tilled their fields, merchants tended their shops, and children ran barefoot through village streets. Within this ordinary routine, however, a simmering tension began to grow, a tension between loyalty to the crown and a desire for self-determination. The colonies were not uniform. In New England, towns and villages were tightly knit, with religion, civic life, and education intertwined. Families and neighbors relied on one another, and town meetings served as the cradle of early political debate. The mid-Atlantic colonies thrived on commerce, trade, and intellectual ferment. Philadelphia, New York, and other urban centers became hubs of discussion, pamphleteering, and debate over liberty and governance. In the South, sprawling plantations produced cash crops like tobacco and rice, relying heavily on enslaved labor, creating an economy and social hierarchy distinct from their northern neighbors. Yet, across all regions, a shared reality emerged: the presence of a distant authority, a monarchy and parliament in London, whose decrees increasingly clashed with the everyday realities and aspirations of the colonists. It was this distant authority that sowed the seeds of discontent. The crown imposed taxes and regulations that colonists found both burdensome and unjust. The Stamp Act of 1765 required printed materials to carry a tax stamp. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed duties on glass, paper, paint, and tea. The Tea Act of 1773, though seemingly minor, became a flashpoint for protest. Colonists argued that taxation without representation violated their rights as Englishmen. Ordinary citizens, merchants, and political leaders began to speak openly about liberty, rights, and self-governance. Pamphlets circulated, letters were exchanged, and newspapers became instruments of both information and agitation. Voices such as Samuel Adams, John Adams, and Patrick Henry articulated frustrations that had simmered for decades, turning scattered grumblings into a unified ideological challenge to British authority. Resistance took both subtle and dramatic forms. Many colonists engaged in boycotts of British goods, refusing to purchase items that carried imperial taxes. Others took bolder action. The Boston Tea Party in 1773, where colonists disguised as Native Americans dumped chests of tea into Boston Harbor, was more than a protest. It was a statement. The act signaled that ordinary men and women were willing to risk imprisonment, property, and life to assert their autonomy. The British responded with the coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, attempting to reassert control. Yet, these measures only intensified opposition, transforming isolated defiance into a united cause. The colonies, once independent in their own small ways, were beginning to see themselves as part of a collective struggle. Amid these tensions, political and military organization began to take shape. Committees of correspondence allowed towns and regions to communicate efficiently, spreading news, coordinating protests, and fostering solidarity. Militias drilled regularly, preparing for the possibility of confrontation with British forces. Ordinary citizens, farmers, artisans, merchants, balanced daily survival with a growing awareness of political struggle. The revolution, at its root, was not a sudden eruption of violence, but a slow, deliberate transformation of identity, loyalties, and vision. The stage was set for inevitable conflict. In April 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. Minutemen, ordinary men called to arms, faced British troops in clashes that were chaotic yet symbolic. The shot heard round the world was not merely a local incident. It was a declaration that the colonies would resist, that ordinary people could and would take extraordinary action to defend their rights. From that moment, the question was no longer whether the colonies would resist, but how and what kind of nation they would become if they succeeded. George Washington emerged as a central figure, chosen for his experience, character, and ability to unify diverse factions. Appointed commander of the Continental Army, he faced daunting challenges: inexperienced soldiers, scarce supplies, and a formidable British military. Yet, Washington's calm leadership provided stability and a sense of purpose. Under his guidance, scattered militias coalesced into armies, and hope persisted even in moments of despair. Washington's presence became a symbol of resilience, inspiring troops and citizens alike. The war was as much a struggle of ideas as it was of arms. Patriots, loyalists, and undecided citizens grappled with questions of allegiance, identity, and future. Families were divided, communities fractured. The revolution demanded courage not only in battle, but in thought, in belief, and in action. Pamphlets, letters, and speeches spread revolutionary ideals, creating networks of communication that inspired action and maintained morale across vast distances. The early years of the war were harsh. Battles at Bunker Hill and in New York revealed the limitations of the Continental Army and the difficulties of sustaining a prolonged conflict. Supplies were scarce, winters brutal, and disease claimed as many lives as bullets. Yet, Victories in unexpected places, such as the daring attack across the Delaware River and the triumph at Trenton, renewed hope and demonstrated that determination and strategy could overcome raw power. Alliances, particularly with France, transformed the Revolution into a global conflict. French support in the form of troops, supplies, and naval power proved decisive. Diplomacy, negotiation, and international strategy became as vital as tactics on the battlefield. Figures like Benjamin Franklin, negotiating in Paris, ensured the American cause gained legitimacy and resources, reflecting the interplay of political vision and military necessity. Civilians endured hardships unimaginable today. Towns occupied by foreign troops, crops destroyed, homes requisitioned, and families separated. Ordinary people became participants in history. Their experiences remind us that revolutions are fought not only on battlefields, but in homes, fields, and communities. The human dimension, resilience, courage, and sacrifice, is as critical to understanding the revolution as strategy or ideology. By the mid-war years, the contours of a new nation began to take shape. Independence was no longer a distant hope. It became tangible. Documents like the Declaration of Independence articulated principles radical for their time: self-governance, human rights, and the legitimacy of rebellion against tyranny. These ideas were revolutionary politically, morally, and philosophically, signaling a global shift in thought about power, authority, and liberty. The war continued, grueling and relentless. Battles at Saratoga, Brandywine, and Monmouth tested strategy, morale, and endurance. Harsh winters, like Valley Forge, forged a disciplined force from scattered militias. Washington's leadership, supported by foreign officers like Baron von Steuben, transformed a fledgling army into a credible fighting force. Every victory, setback, and act of courage, by generals and foot soldiers alike, moved the colonies closer to self-determination. Guerrilla tactics in the southern colonies, led by figures like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, exemplified ingenuity and resilience. Battles spread far and wide, not only in cities but across forests, swamps, and riverbanks, testing logistics, communication, and endurance. Each skirmish reinforced the ideals of liberty and self-rule alongside immediate military objectives. The alliance with France culminated at Yorktown, where combined American and French forces surrounded British General Cornwallis. The siege was a military and diplomatic triumph, demonstrating the power of coordination, planning, and international support. When Cornwallis surrendered in 1781, the Revolution had reached a decisive turning point. Yet independence was only the beginning. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formalized the end of hostilities, granting recognition to the United States. New challenges arose, creating a constitution, establishing governance, reconciling regional differences, and determining the place of enslaved people, Native Americans, and Loyalists in the new nation. The Revolution reshaped the political landscape, but nation-building had only begun. The story of the American Revolution is both grand and intimate. It is a tale of strategy, battle, and diplomacy, but also of personal courage, sacrifice, and vision. Ordinary people daring to imagine a different world, guided by ideals and determination, reshaped history. This narrative continues to inspire generations, demonstrating how a people, united by principle, can redefine the future. As the war progressed, the reality of revolution became increasingly complex. Battles were no longer isolated events. They were chapters in a long, arduous struggle that tested the limits of human endurance, leadership, and loyalty. The early optimism of Lexington and Concord and Trenton gave way to the harsh truth. The path to independence would demand sacrifice, resilience, and ingenuity. Civilians and soldiers alike discovered that liberty came at a price, often exacted in blood, hunger, and uncertainty. The Continental Army, under Washington's leadership, faced formidable challenges. Supplies were scarce, uniforms threadbare, and food often inadequate. Soldiers' pay was irregular, and enlistments were short-term, leaving the army vulnerable to attrition. Disease, particularly smallpox, claimed countless lives. Yet amidst these hardships, a sense of purpose endured. Washington understood that leadership was not simply about military strategy, but also about maintaining morale, fostering unity, and inspiring belief in an ideal that transcended the hardships of daily survival. Letters and diaries from soldiers reveal their courage, their doubts, and their unwavering commitment to a cause they could scarcely yet envision in its full scope. The war extended beyond traditional battlefields. The conflict was as much political as it was military, and the colonies were divided. Loyalists, colonists who remained faithful to the crown, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They faced persecution, confiscation of property, and exile. Their stories remind us that revolutions are rarely clean struggles between uniformed armies. They are messy, personal, and often tragic. Families were split, communities fractured, and neighbors found themselves on opposing sides. In the midst of chaos, ordinary citizens became both actors and witnesses, navigating a world where the definitions of right and wrong were tested by circumstance and conviction. In the North, major battles demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of the Continental Army. The Battle of Bunker Hill, fought in June 1775, was a Pyrrhic victory for the British, but a symbolic triumph for the Americans. Though they eventually lost the ground, the colonists' tenacity and courage against well-trained troops boosted morale and proved that resistance was possible. Subsequent engagements in New York and New Jersey tested strategy and endurance. The harsh winter at Valley Forge, where soldiers endured cold, hunger, and disease, became emblematic of the Revolution's human cost. Yet it also became a crucible of transformation. Under the guidance of officers like Baron von Steuben, the army emerged disciplined, cohesive, and prepared to face a professional enemy. Southern campaigns introduced new challenges. The British hoped to exploit loyalist sympathies and gain control of the South, where plantations and trade networks offered strategic and economic advantages. Guerrilla warfare emerged as a critical tactic, with figures like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, employing knowledge of the terrain to harass British forces. Small bands of patriots struck quickly and disappeared into forests and swamps, destabilizing enemy operations and demonstrating that conventional tactics alone could not suppress a determined mobile resistance. The South became a theater where innovation, resilience, and local knowledge proved as decisive as raw military power. Diplomacy became as crucial as the battlefield. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and other envoys in Europe worked tirelessly to secure recognition, aid, and alliances. France, driven by both rivalry with Britain and admiration for the American cause, provided troops, weapons, and naval support. Spain and the Netherlands also contributed to the broader global struggle that the Revolution had become. The success at Saratoga in 1777, a major turning point, convinced France of the viability of the American cause. French military and financial support transformed the Revolution from a regional rebellion into a conflict with global dimensions, illustrating the interconnected nature of 18th century geopolitics. Throughout the war, logistics and strategy were inextricably linked. Roads, rivers, and ports dictated troop movements, supply chains, and communication. Both sides struggled with the challenge of sustaining armies over vast territories. The British, despite their resources, were constrained by distance and unfamiliar terrain. The Americans, though limited in resources, leveraged knowledge of the land, local support, and adaptability. This interplay of strategy, geography, and human ingenuity underscored the Revolution as a contest not only of arms, but of will, intelligence, and creativity. Civilian life during the war was marked by resilience and suffering. Towns were occupied, crops destroyed, and homes requisitioned. Women took on expanded roles, managing households, farms, and businesses, even as husbands and sons went to war. Spies, messengers, and local militias operated within communities, contributing to the struggle in ways both visible and hidden. Letters, diaries, and memoirs reveal the courage of civilians who navigated scarcity, fear, and uncertainty, embodying the Revolution's moral and social dimensions. As battles raged, ideas about governance, liberty, and equality evolved. The Declaration of Independence, issued in 1776, articulated principles that resonated far beyond the immediate military struggle. The document S, assertion that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, challenged centuries of hierarchical authority. These revolutionary ideals provided not only a rationale for war, but a vision for a new society, shaping the aspirations of soldiers, leaders, and ordinary citizens alike. American victories, though uneven, proved the value of persistence and strategic ingenuity. Washington's Orias crossing of the Delaware River and the subsequent victory at Trenton in December 1776 provided a dramatic morale boost. The capture of Hessian troops, the careful use of surprise, and the exploitation of enemy overconfidence exemplified the combination of audacity and strategy that characterized the Continental Army. Each engagement, whether a major battle or a small skirmish, contributed to the evolving identity of the American forces and their capacity to withstand adversity. By 1778, the Revolution had become a truly global conflict. French involvement brought naval power to the American side, disrupting British supply lines and supporting combined operations. Spain and the Netherlands entered the struggle indirectly, further stretching British resources. The war demonstrated that the Revolution was not a purely domestic rebellion, but a contest with worldwide implications. The fight for independence had become part of a broader dialogue about liberty, power, and the legitimacy of authority, echoing across continents. Yet even with foreign support and hard-won victories, the struggle remained fraught with uncertainty. Soldiers deserted, supplies ran low, and disease continued to take its toll. Washington, aware that morale was fragile, worked tirelessly to maintain unity and focus. Correspondence, speeches, and personal example were as crucial as military maneuvers in sustaining the cause. The Revolution demanded both resilience and imagination, challenging Americans to envision a nation yet to exist while surviving the realities of war. Guerrilla tactics in the southern colonies continued to frustrate the British. Small bands of patriots, using speed, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the landscape, undermined larger, conventional forces. Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and other leaders became legends not only for their victories, but for their ability to inspire local populations. The war in the South illustrated the Revolution's adaptability, highlighting the interplay between local initiative and broader strategic objectives. Amid the conflict, diplomacy continued to play a pivotal role. Franklin and other envoys navigated the courts of Europe, securing financial and military support that proved essential. Treaties with France, Spain, and the Netherlands shifted the balance of power, demonstrating that the revolution's outcome depended as much on international alliances as on battlefield victories. By the end of Part 2, the revolution had matured into a multifaceted struggle, a war of armies, an ideological contest, a political upheaval, and a social transformation. The colonies were no longer disparate settlements. They had become a nation in formation, united by shared ideals and common sacrifice. Battles, diplomacy, and human endurance had shaped an emerging identity, one that would carry the revolution into its final and decisive stages. By the late 1770s, the American Revolution had reached a critical juncture. The struggle for independence was no longer confined to scattered battles in the northern colonies. It had become a widespread, relentless contest that touched every corner of the emerging nation. The Continental Army, tempered by adversity, had become a disciplined, determined force, while the colonies themselves were forging a sense of unity born of shared sacrifice and common purpose. Yet the path to victory remained uncertain, and every decision carried profound consequences. In the North, pivotal victories bolstered morale and reshaped the strategic landscape. The Battle of Saratoga in 1777 proved decisive, demonstrating that American forces could defeat the British in significant engagements. General Horatio Gates, alongside Benedict Arnold and other key leaders, orchestrated a series of maneuvers that culminated in the surrender of a major British army. The victory at Saratoga not only invigorated American spirits, but also convinced France of the revolution's viability, ultimately securing the critical alliance that would tip the scales in favor of the colonies. French involvement altered the course of the war dramatically. France provided troops, warships, financial support, and strategic counsel. The presence of French forces on American soil, along with the French Navy, challenged British supremacy and expanded the revolution into a global conflict. Spain and the Netherlands also contributed indirectly, stretching British resources and creating multiple fronts. The revolution had transcended its local origins, becoming an international struggle that tested diplomacy, logistics, and military ingenuity on a scale previously unimaginable for the colonies. In the South, the war took on a different character. British forces sought to exploit Loyalist support, hoping to regain control over the southern colonies and their economic resources. Yet American patriots, using unconventional warfare, complicated these efforts. Guerrilla tactics, pioneered by leaders such as Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, destabilized British operations. Small mobile bands struck swiftly, then vanished into forests, swamps, and river valleys. These tactics, grounded in intimate knowledge of the land, complemented the larger strategic efforts of the Continental Army and underscored the revolution's adaptability and ingenuity. Civilian life remained deeply affected by the ongoing conflict. Towns were occupied and often looted by opposing forces, while farms and trade networks were disrupted. Women, children, and the elderly assumed responsibilities traditionally held by men, managing households, farms, and businesses while contributing to the war effort in countless unseen ways. Spies and messengers operated in towns and villages, gathering intelligence and facilitating communication. Diaries, letters, and memoirs from this period reveal the resilience, courage, and determination of ordinary citizens, highlighting the human cost of revolution and the profound role of society in sustaining the struggle. The Continental Army, though increasingly disciplined, continued to face challenges of logistics and supply. Harsh winters, such as those endured at Valley Forge, tested the limits of endurance. Soldiers dealt with inadequate clothing, food shortages, and rampant disease. Yet adversity became a crucible, forging cohesion, determination, and loyalty. Training provided by foreign officers, particularly Baron von Steuben, instilled discipline and introduced essential military techniques that enhanced combat effectiveness. Washington's leadership, balancing strategic foresight with personal example, ensured that the Army remained resilient and committed to the larger vision of independence. Diplomacy remained inseparable from military strategy. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and other envoys negotiated tirelessly in Europe, securing treaties, financial aid, and material support. The Franco-American alliance was particularly consequential, providing critical manpower, naval power, and supplies. French generals, such as Rochambeau, coordinated with Washington to plan combined operations that would ultimately prove decisive. These international dimensions underscored that the revolution was both a domestic struggle for independence and a geopolitical contest with global ramifications. As the war entered its final stages, the focus shifted towards strategic consolidation. American forces, strengthened by alliances and bolstered by experience, sought to contain and defeat British forces through a combination of conventional and irregular warfare. Key battles and sieges, including the campaign leading to Yorktown, demonstrated the maturation of American strategy. Coordination between Continental and French forces, combined with the strategic use of terrain and timing, allowed the Americans to encircle and compel the surrender of General Cornwallis's army. The victory at Yorktown in 1781 marked a decisive turning point. Cornwallis's surrender was not merely a military event, it was a symbolic confirmation that the American Revolution could succeed. Celebrations erupted across the colonies, yet reflection accompanied triumph. The war had exacted a staggering toll. Thousands of lives lost, communities disrupted, and immense economic strain. The fight for independence had been arduous, transformative, and profoundly human in its consequences. Beyond military victory, the revolution catalyzed fundamental social and political transformations. The Declaration of Independence had articulated principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance, but the challenge of implementing those ideals remained. Questions of representation, governance, and citizenship loomed large. How could a fledgling nation reconcile regional differences, integrate diverse populations, and construct a functioning government capable of sustaining the ideals for which it had fought? These questions foreshadowed debates that would shape the United States for decades to come. The human dimension of the revolution remained central. Soldiers returned home to disrupted communities. Families struggled to rebuild. Loyalists faced displacement, exile, or reconciliation. The sacrifices of ordinary people, those who labored, endured, and risked life and property, were as integral to the revolution's success as the decisions of generals and politicians. Their experiences illustrate that revolutions are not only contests of armies or ideas, but deeply social processes that transform lives and societies. As Part 3 concludes, the narrative of the revolution reflects a convergence of courage, strategy, diplomacy, and human resilience. The colonies had evolved from disparate settlements into a united entity capable of challenging the most powerful empire in the world. The ideals that inspired rebellion had endured the crucible of conflict, and the foundations of a new nation were being laid, ready to emerge into a world forever changed. By 1781, the American Revolution had entered its final and decisive phase. The surrender of British General Cornwallis at Yorktown marked not just a military victory, but the affirmation of a vision that had begun decades earlier in quiet towns and villages along the eastern seaboard. The shot heard round the world had transformed into a global event. The 13 colonies were on the threshold of independence, their people united by the ideals, sacrifices, and struggles that had defined the revolution. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formalized the end of hostilities. Britain recognized the sovereignty of the United States, granting independence to a nation that had been born in blood, courage, and unwavering commitment. Yet recognition on paper did not erase the hardships endured, nor did it resolve the immense challenges ahead. Thousands of soldiers returned to disrupted communities. Families sought to rebuild homes and livelihoods that had been consumed by war. Loyalists, those who had remained faithful to the crown, faced confiscation of property, exile, or social marginalization. The new nation inherited the profound complexities of liberty, requiring careful negotiation of law, order, and social cohesion. The revolution's victories were the result of an intricate interplay of strategy, diplomacy, and human resilience. The Continental Army, initially composed of inexperienced militias, had been molded into a disciplined force through training, leadership, and endurance. George Washington's guidance exemplified the power of steady leadership in times of uncertainty. His presence, both on the battlefield and in the hearts of his soldiers, ensured that hope endured, even in the darkest moments of famine, disease, and retreat. The leadership of figures like Washington, coupled with the brilliance of diplomats like Benjamin Franklin, demonstrated that victory demanded vision as much as valor. The war also catalyzed social transformation. Women, who had managed households, farms, and businesses in the absence of men, gained a renewed sense of agency. Spies, messengers, and local militias, often composed of ordinary citizens, highlighted the revolution's dependence on collective action and civic participation. The experiences of enslaved people, Native Americans, and Loyalists underscored the uneven distribution of liberty in the new nation, revealing that the promise of independence was intertwined with ongoing struggles for equality, recognition, and justice. The Declaration of Independence, issued in 1776, had articulated principles radical for their time. Governments derived their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and people possessed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideals, while inspirational, posed practical questions. How would they be implemented across diverse populations? How would the new nation reconcile regional differences, economic disparities, and the legacies of slavery and inequality? The revolution had ended the war, but it had inaugurated a larger project, the creation of a functioning, just, and enduring republic. The post-war period was one of intense debate and nation-building. The Articles of Confederation provided an initial framework for governance, but revealed weaknesses in central authority and coordination. Leaders, drawing on both the lessons of the Revolution and philosophical ideals, began drafting what would become the United States Constitution, a document designed to balance liberty and order, federal authority and local autonomy, individual rights, and collective responsibility. The Constitution, ratified in 1788, represented the culmination of revolutionary thinking, a commitment to self-governance and the rule of law as the foundation of a new society. The Revolution's international impact was profound. Ideas of liberty and self-determination inspired political movements in Europe and Latin America, reverberating far beyond North America. The success of the American colonies demonstrated that entrenched power could be challenged, that ordinary citizens could reshape their destinies, and that ideals of freedom could transcend borders. The Revolution was not merely a military victory, it was a transformative moment in human history, redefining the relationship between people and government. Yet the human cost of revolution remained visible. Entire communities had been displaced, economies disrupted, and social structures altered. Soldiers returned home to uncertain futures, carrying the physical and emotional scars of combat. Families rebuilt, children grew up in a world shaped by both hardship and hope, and ordinary citizens continued to navigate the fragile and complex reality of independence. The Revolution, while completed militarily, continued to unfold socially, politically, and culturally for decades to come. The birth of the United States was therefore both dramatic and gradual. Military triumphs secured territory and sovereignty, but nationhood required more than victory in battle. It demanded imagination, dialogue, compromise, and the persistent application of principles in everyday governance. It required citizens willing to participate in civic life, to uphold ideals, and to hold leaders accountable. It required vigilance and a recognition that liberty, once won, must be protected, nurtured, and expanded. As the last British troops departed and the new government took shape, the American Revolution revealed a profound truth, that freedom is not given, it is claimed, defended, and continuously renewed. The Revolution was not solely the story of generals and diplomats, though their contributions were essential. It was the story of ordinary people, farmers, merchants, artisans, women, children, and soldiers, whose courage, endurance, and imagination made independence possible. Their collective experience shaped the character, identity, and ideals of a nation in its infancy. The Revolution also left a legacy of questions that would continue to define the United States. Who counted as a citizen? How would equality and liberty be balanced with economic and social realities? How could a nation reconcile regional, racial, and economic differences while remaining united? The answers would not come easily, but the Revolution provided the framework, a belief in self-determination, the legitimacy of dissent, and the possibility of a government accountable to the people. In reflecting on the American Revolution, one recognizes it as both grand and intimate. It was a global struggle and a personal journey. It was an ideological contest, a military campaign, and a social transformation. It was a story of vision, courage, and perseverance. The Revolution reminds us that the making of a nation is never a single event, but a continuum of struggles, sacrifices, and achievements. The United States, born from these struggles, carries within its foundations the ideals, lessons, and experiences of those who dared to imagine a different future and then worked tirelessly to make it real. By the end of the Revolution, the 13 colonies had not only achieved independence, they had transformed into a nation capable of governance, self-reflection, and ambition. The trials of war, the debates over governance, and the everyday acts of resilience had forged a people with a shared identity and a shared purpose. The American Revolution, in its triumphs and tragedies, laid the groundwork for a nation that continues to grapple with its ideals, expanding the meaning of liberty, democracy, and justice for generations to come. The Revolution, in essence, is both a conclusion and a beginning, the closing chapter of a war for independence and the opening chapter of a continuing experiment in self-governance. It is a story of ordinary people achieving extraordinary ends, of ideas becoming action, and of a nation, newly born, standing to face the future, guided by the vision of liberty and the enduring belief that freedom, once won, must always be defended.